Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a look at audit programs, objectives, scopes, and audit program steps. To help us better understand audit programs and some of the key elements about it relates to objectives, scope, program steps, and so on, we have with us today Kathleen Crawford, who is going to help us better understand these dynamics. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So, we would like to know more about audit programs and some of the characteristics of them. So, can we start with objectives and how those play a role in the development of audit programs?
Certainly. Well, one thing I'd really like our viewers to understand is that the harmony between objectives and scope and the test steps themselves are really quite important. The audit program objective answers the question why. So, why are we doing this review? We're doing it to evaluate something, to determine something, to assess something, and we have a very helpful acronym to help us with this. We might be thinking about compliance with policies and procedures. We might be talking about achievement of goals, several other things, the reliability of data or the reliability of documents. So the CARES acronym can be a really good cheat, if you will, in terms of deciding or articulating what it is we're going to do. But I will say the one thing that newer auditors should be mindful of is to be careful of absolutes. So one word that I recommend we not use is the word ensure, ENSURE, because that implies a guarantee that we're going to look at everything related to something, and that's not possible in the context of internal auditing.
In internal audit, we say that we do or we provide reasonable assurance, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I
Okay,
want them to come away with.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the why of it is important, but so is the when or the where. That's where the audit scope comes in. So the scope will be a limiter of sorts. So we're not going to boil the ocean. We're not going to look at everything related to compliance on a particular area. There are certain aspects of it that we might be particularly interested in. So the scope is developed after the objectives have been determined, and often will be crafted in the context of a location or of timing. So it can include parameters of a process, it can include specific areas that we want to review. Time periods is a very common parameter that's used, so that's why we bring in the when question. Sample size is sometimes mentioned in the scope statement, as is the methodology that's employed. So any of these could apply, and this is what creates the concept of offense. We're not looking at everything. We're looking at a limited amount so that we can provide that reasonable assurance that you referred to.
So these two pieces come together then. We have the objectives that will define what exactly this engagement is all about, and then the scope that is going to help you achieve that objective. But it seems to
Absolutely.
me that we also have a challenge when it comes to the potential for this word that auditors use quite often as well, scope creep.
True.
So I will imagine this will help you to stay within the boundaries of what your goals are so you don't drift around and do things that are not related to what you are supposed to be doing. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's something that newer auditors really need to get an appreciation for.
hmm Okay. All right. Great. Now, as far as the time period being reviewed, so a lot of reviews are, and I've done reviews over the years where you're sometimes looking at things over just one quarter, but those are usually financial type reviews or maybe even compliance reviews. And then you get into a full year's worth, which can also be compliance or financial, but operational can start
Mm-hmm.
to get into that time frame. But then multi-year can also be part of your scope. So you could end up looking at 2, 3, 4 years worth of data for operational reviews, for strategic reviews, and so on. Is that right?
Absolutely, especially if you have a really good data analytics team that will help you with
hmm
that. You'll be able to look at longer periods of time, greater sized populations. These are all possible with data analytics. But if you're relying on statistical or non statistical sampling, then that becomes a little bit more difficult.
It does, yes. Now, in terms of the duration, this also opens the door for being able to do some trend analysis
Hmm.
and looking at seasonality of data and various things like those, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. So, how about the specific procedures? What are kind of the things that you will do as far as those engagement steps? What kinds of action words do we use that help describe what exactly the author should be doing?
Yeah, well, like a lot of professions, we have our own verbiage, our own terms. So the test
Hmm.
steps themselves within the program. So I referred to this idea of harmony. We want to see
Hmm.
harmony between the why and the how here, as well as the where or the when. So
Hmm.
these test steps will be expressed in, like you say, action verbs typically. Now, the ones that we happen to have here are tilting toward financial audits.
Hmm.
So we're tracing information from one subledger to another, or we're comparing information or aspects of information. So we have a lot of action verbs that can guide us in terms of giving us the signals of what we've been tasked with doing.
Hmm.
I would not say that these are exhaustive, but they're pretty representative of when a newer auditor gets an audit program, pretty representative of the language that he or she is likely to see.
So let me see if I remember. So tracing goes in one direction and vouching goes in the opposite direction, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So tracing, you would trace from the source
Source
to the
document.
destination,
Mm-hmm.
and the vouching goes from the destination to the source. All
Exactly,
right, very good. I got that one right. Okay.
exactly.
And footing and cross footing, is that like the body where you're
No.
putting kind of like, no, no? What
Nothing
is
to
that
do with the
like?
body. That's also a very it's kind of an archaic term, but those folks who are familiar with financial auditing, specifically people who might come up out of public accounting, would probably be very accustomed to footing and cross-footing an Excel spreadsheet. So footing
Uh-huh.
is adding a column of numbers and finding out
Yeah.
what the subtotal is, and cross-footing is truing up the list that goes across. So making sure that those two totals are exactly the same.
You know what's interesting about that particular procedure? Because I remember early on, I had to do one of those, and I thought it was one of those things where you say, well, computers already know how to add rows
Mm-hmm.
and columns, and why am I doing this? But let's just go ahead and do it because it's kind of a standard practice. And once you know that, I found fraud because of it. The funny thing was that I was going through adding these rows and columns, and I couldn't get the report to tie out
Mm-hmm.
for some P card transactions. And as I was going through, I said, this is odd. Why can't I put this and verify the totals? So I went back and looked for the source document because what I was working was for some copies. It turns out that the secretary had been performing transactions or making purchases
Mm-mm.
and was getting their reports back from the bank. She will then cut out, I mean, this is talk about low tech, right? She will basically just cut out the transaction that were showing up under miscellaneous and then running it through the copier and then taking all of the receipts and giving it to the boss. But of course, the receipts related to what she was buying was not there.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just basically a document that had been cut and made a copy of. And then the reviewer was just basically signing off on things, not reviewing anything.
Yes.
So I was able to find a pretty substantial fraud where she was buying a lot of personal items. And of course, right after that, she was dismissed and charges were brought against her. But again, these procedures may seem mundane on the surface, but there's a reason why auditors do all of these things.
Yes.
So,
In
yeah.
fact, I remember several colleagues talking about how they had to go back and recalculate a lot of spreadsheet uploads to financial statements because not because of fraud, but because formulae had been copied and pasted incorrectly. And so
Hmm.
you're absolutely right that the subtotals were not truing up properly, and they were not accurately portraying their financial statements. So it was pretty commonplace after Sarbanes-Oxley, and then after one of the earlier versions of COSO, that organizations had to double check those spreadsheets for very common errors, and many of them had to do with footing and cross-footing totals.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and it's another procedure, right? Touring. I
Yes.
love that because it always reminds me of auditors who work for resorts and cruise liners and things like that. I also enjoy those, or hospitality where they have a restaurant and you have to tour and maybe sample things. You don't mean that
Yes.
in terms of sampling necessarily, right? Not necessarily tasting the
No.
food and desserts.
No, but similar to observing something, I think touring a facility, it may not be the strongest technique, but it's such a great springboard to better
Mm,
understanding of how something actually works. It's quite
yeah,
one thing to read through procedural documentation, and quite another to see how the process is carried out. And by touring a facility, you see a lot of things and understand them a lot better than you would have if you had just relied on the printed word.
exactly. And I brought that up for that reason because over the years I've done a lot of work in industrial environments, manufacturing, and so on. And you walk through the facilities, you walk through the plant, and you see whether or not inventory is properly segregated, how they handle
Mm-hmm.
incoming and outgoing merchandise, whether or not the safeguarding of assets, right, the fencing. And one of those, again, another of those interesting scenarios where went to a facility and looked at the perimeter. That was part of the procedure to look at the perimeter fencing for protection and so on. And of course, the front, the street facing side of things, very nicely laid out, fencing, landscaping, everything was beautiful. And as you start to look at the sides and back, it was wide open. So, it's those kinds of things. So walk around, take a look, and be very observant. Not just what they show you or want you to see, but every once in a while, look behind that door,
Mm-hmm.
look behind that shop, open up a box or two and make sure the contents that they're supposed to be there are there, which brings me to counting as well. And when it comes to inventory, some of the things that I have seen over the years and other things that others have shared with me over the years as well, um, cases where merchandise was being moved.
Mm-hmm.
So, or empty boxes were displayed. There were no contents there, which of course are going to show on the financial statements improper calculations and valuations. So you have all of those dynamics as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what would an audit program look like? Do you have an example
I
to show
do.
us?
I do. And I
Mhm.
think that that's what we want to bring home to our viewers is the harmony between these three parts of the audit program. So we have an objective. That's the why of what we're doing. And in this case, we're evaluating the adequacy of internal controls over cash receipts in the treasury function. This objective is actually slightly unusual in the sense that it already has put a bit of a fence on what the auditors are going to look at. It's only the internal controls over cash receipts, not internal controls in general in Treasury, but over cash receipts. And then the scope statement has to, as you said, is a quarter. So the quarter ended March 31st of some year in this century. And then the test steps, selecting a sample and verifying dates of receipt are accurate. So you see that the test steps begin affirmatively with verbs: select, determine, verify, review, investigate, and document. Not all programs will have those specific verbs, but this is a really good representation and it flows. That's another thing, that we want to see test steps that are in order according to a logical way of getting through the work. So selecting a
Mhm.
sample and then looking at comparing receipts to amounts deposited, like your example with the secretary, and that it wasn't
Mhm.
once you looked at it, you found it wasn't really properly documented. So
Yes.
this is a really good example of that harmony. And that's what I want our viewers to look for and recognize. And if they see something that doesn't appear to be harmonious or the test steps appear to be out of order, ask the question. There might be some rationale for it that's not apparent to us. Whoever prepared the program will know what the rationale is, and then we can make sure that we follow the path that that person has laid out for us.
Right. Yes, one thing that caught my attention is the supervisory review, and there have been a lot of guidance recently in terms of what the approval entails. And before the approval, there should be a review, and what does the review entail also needs to be understood. What are the procedures? So the approver is going to look at this figure compared to that figure, make sure they agree, or something like that.
Right.
Those details need to be very clearly documented, well understood, number one, and documented as well, so that there's no rubber stamping, which is one of the biggest problems associated with approvers or approvals that are really not really worth anything, because individuals just basically put a signature, an initial, or a stamp, but they did not go through the process of reviewing the transactions like they were supposed to. So that's an important thing to capture there as well. And then the last thing mentioned there is in terms of documentation, make sure it is comprehensive in case someone else wants to reproduce this. Because remember, you may not be the one who does the testing. And even after it is done now, someone else may want to reproduce it later or repeat it later. So you want to make sure your documentation is thorough. So anyone who looks at it knows what you did, why you did it, and what the results were. So,
right, absolutely. Yeah. So in another segment, when we talk about work papers, that point is very much made for our viewers as well, is that this is telling us what we're going to do, but we have to show the work that we performed.
There's an expression, right? If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So it needs to be documented. Very
Absolutely.
good, very good. Thank you very much, Kathleen. I really appreciate your help helping us understand the objectives, the scopes, and the different steps that we follow through when we're doing an audit program. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.